All right, welcome to the third module or the third video for our evolution module. In this video, we're going to discuss where we can get evidence for evolution. So we finished up in the second video talking about how evolution is a theory, and that means that it's backed by a lot of evidence and a lot of support from numerous amounts of research and observations. So where exactly does that evidence come from? And this is what we're going to discuss in the third video for this module. And so one of the key um, key kind of sources for evidence on evolution is from fossils. And evolution will leave these obvious signs in our natural environment, and it does so in the form of fossils, remains of organisms that we can find as we kind of dig or excavate certain landscapes. We also can find imprints of organisms, so not necessarily fossils of, say, hard body parts, but maybe footprints or impressions that we can use to look at and determine how life has changed throughout its evolutionary history. And what fossils and these imprints are really important for is looking at the differences between past and present organisms. So really looking at how organisms from the past differ from organisms today. And we can also determine or find organisms that are now extinct. So for example, one of the more famous examples is or are dinosaurs. So we don't find dinosaurs alive on the landscape today. We have their ancestors alive, but we can go back and dig in specific places and find their remains, which allows us to understand what these organisms would have looked like and potentially acted like in terms of behavior and how they would have looked in terms of um, phenotypic appearances in the past. Now, with fossils, the soft parts usually decay away. Now, because these soft parts decay, that means that generally we don't find the soft parts of the organisms as remains or part of the fossilization process. It's usually the hard parts that we find because those hard parts are rich in minerals that can be fossilized and undergo that fossilization process. So generally, some examples of remains that we find are, say, fossilized skeletal features. So for example, we have a skeleton of a dinosaur here, or you can find fossilized minerals that replace, say, the organic material of a tree. And so here you actually have a fossilized tree. Or we can find imprints, right? So imprints of footprints that are 120 million years old that were left by dinosaurs. One of the more famous fossilizations, which is famous because of Jurassic Park, is insects being found in amber. So, for example, a mosquito found in amber, or I don't know if it's a mosquito, but some sort of insect that's 45 million years old. And basically, tree resin um, covered this insect and it became embedded in that resin. Every now and then, scientists can get extremely lucky and search the frozen landscapes of the northern hemisphere where a lot of permafrost exists. And this permafrost is this frozen ground. And so if you can freeze the soft tissues, then they actually preserve really well. And so, for example, here is a baby mammoth that was found in northern Russia, and this baby mammoth is 40,000 years old, and it's essentially been frozen and um, kept in pretty good condition for 40,000 years, which is a pretty astounding find. and sometimes they can find, remains in stomach contents, um, where these animals have been frozen. You can actually see what the last meal of that animal was. And so permafrost are really good conditions for keeping remains intact, and really can lead to interesting finds. And also, and so another thing we can think about is that not all fossils that we find are actually remains of organisms, but what we can find are casts, basically, so molds of what the organism that was in that location. And so what happens is an organism will be buried and it can decompose, and it will leave this empty mold that allows us to see the shape of what was in that area, or that fossil. You also imprints, so footprints, which we showed in the previous slide, or burrows, will remain after those organisms decay and go away. And then also coprolites, which are fossilized species and fossilized. And you also can find fossilized eggs. And so that's kind of a remnant of an organism, where you find fossilized eggs. So for example, scientists have found fossilized nests, which is pretty cool. And the scientists who study fossils are known as paleontologists. So they are the researchers that go out and search for fossils and study fossils to try to identify past organisms and the characteristics of those past organisms. And so what we can do with the data that paleontologists generate is we can organize that data based off of, dates that we get for the fossils we find, and we can order those fossils as a sequence and how they appear in the rock layers, and we can look at how species and how diversity changes through geologic time and throughout the Earth's history. And the way the layering and the deposition of sediments work is that older sediments get covered up by new sediments. And so that means the youngest layers are always at the top of the formation. And the oldest layers are always found deeper underneath the formation. And so you can get relative ages of fossils by determining the ages in which kind of the fossils are found, or the surrounding layers in which the fossils are found. And so you can use that to get pretty good estimates of when these fossils were alive on the landscape, or when, or not alive, but when they were deposited and fossilized on the landscape during that deposition process. And what's really interesting is Darwin actually acknowledged the fossil record in his research. And he acknowledged the fact that the fossil record is incomplete, that we are not able to go out and find every single organism that ever lived in this continuous fossil record, just because of the way the fossilization process works, and also because of geological factors. A lot of the organisms on Earth that have lived on Earth lived in areas where fossilization doesn't really happen, so it doesn't favor fossilization. So if there's a lot of oxygen, you have a lot of decomposition. And so some of the areas that favor fossilization are areas like anoxic areas, where you don't have a lot of decomposition, where areas like permafrost, where those organisms can become frozen, or areas where they can be buried relatively quickly. And so a lot of the Earth doesn't favor that fossilization process. And so we miss a lot of the organisms because they just don't become fossilized. They just decay and become recycled back into the ecosystems. And also, if a fossil does form, it has to remain intact until we can find it. And a lot of the times fossils can be destroyed or disordered by geological processes. So for example, subduction, where you have a plate subducting underneath another continental plate. And that subducting plate, once it gets down far enough underneath the Earth's surface, will eventually be exposed to high enough temperatures where that material will melt and turn into magma, and so you get fossils being destroyed that way. Whenever you have lots of pressure and movement of plates against each other, you get, sedimentary rocks being changed into metamorphic rocks, and so that destroys the fossils in that process. And then also, not all fossils that are preserved are accessible. There are fossils that are probably really deep down that we just don't have access to, and we can't get. We rely on geological forces to push some of these rock features and rock layers upwards to the surface of the earth so that we can access those fossils. Erosion helps us to access fossils. And so, a lot of the fossils that are across, in the earth's surface just aren't accessible for paleontologists. And so it was really interesting that Darwin kind of acknowledged this and knew that the fossil record was incomplete and that there are going to be some inconsistencies and gaps in the fossil record as we, kind of move forward looking at the ancestry of species and the evolutionary history of species throughout Earth history. So another form of evidence, aside from fossils, that we can use to understand evolution is the presence of homologies. And homologies are features that occur in organisms that arise from common ancestry. And basically what a homology is let's say you have a characteristic that's present in an ancestral organism. Over time, that feature will be altered by natural selection when the descendants of that ancestor interact or experience different environmental conditions. And so what ends up happening is that feature in those related species can have characteristics that are similar but serves a different function. Okay? One of the more common homologies that is referenced is the vertebrate forelimb. And so just looking at this figure here, so all the vertebrates have a common ancestor, right? And the vertebrate forelimb evolved in an ancestor that is shared by humans, cats, whales, and bats. And so we have this common structure that was passed down to all four of these groups via a common ancestor, but this structure has modified through selection and evolutionary processes that leads to a different function, even though these structures are somewhat similar. So for the vertebrate forelimb, we have the human arm, the cat limb, a flipper on a whale, and then the wing of a bat. And if you look at the bone structures, you can actually see the same bones are in all of these forelimbs. It's just that the shape and structure of these bones have been slightly modified. So for example, in the whale, you have your long bones in your arms to be shortened, and then your phalanges to be considerably lengthened, as well as the digits in the bat wing to be lengthened to serve as a flipper or a wing, and so attachment points for the membrane in the bat wing, etc. And so it's a similar structure, but it's been modified for flying, for swimming, for walking on all fours, and then for grasping. Right? So very similar feature, but that feature serves a different function in related organisms. Okay, and so that's what a homology is. And With the advances in molecular biology, so being able to obtain DNA for organisms and then examining the DNA structures, science has been able to really increase our understanding of homologies through this process. Um, the evolutionary history of species is documented in their DNA because their DNA is inherited from parent to offspring, and so it's inherited from ancestral species to the descendant species. And so if two species have homologous genes, meaning that their gene sequences are very closely in the nucleotides that they have, so they match really closely with one another, then what scientists can infer is that those sequences must have been inherited from a common ancestor. Whereas if you have two sequences that have a number of differences in nucleotides, then they must be more distantly related. Um, and so we can look at the amount of differences between genetic sequences to determine how closely related species are from one another. And so what molecular biology does is it provides this really strong evidence that all life forms on Earth are related and can be traced back to um, a single common ancestor. Because all organisms use DNA and RNA as their genetic language and their genetic code. Like we mentioned in the DNA chapter, the RNA triplets are used universally. So every living organism that makes proteins are using the RNA to make those proteins. And we're talking about organisms that are as different from humans like bacteria. Bacteria and humans actually share homologous sequences in our DNA that were inherited from a common ancestor way, way back throughout Earth's evolutionary history. Another form of evidence for homologies is vestigial structures. Vestigial structures basically are remnants of structures that used to be important in an ancestor. And so some examples of these are um, hind leg bones that are in ancient whales and pelvic bones. So in modern whales, they still have this modified, like reduced pelvic structure, but they don't have any hind legs. But their ancestors, like the Pachycetus, did have hind legs, and so it needed a pelvis. And so that pelvic girdle that's in modern whales is just a remnant version of the pelvic girdle from their ancestors, and it doesn't have a use today. So it's basically a vestigial structure. Another example is our appendix. Doesn't really have a use in humans, although more research is showing that maybe that's not necessarily the case. But based off of current theory and knowledge, the appendix is this vestigial structure that's not really used in humans, but was used in our ancestors. Um, Another example is a pelvic girdle in snakes. So for example, there is little bones in the snakes that don't have limbs that has a remnant of a pelvic girdle. Goosebumps in humans is a vestigial structure, so no real function, but it did have a function in its ancestors. Another interesting line of evidence that comes from homologous and homologous structures is homology through embryonic development. And this is super interesting to me. Basically, if you look at an embryo of almost any vertebrate species early on in the those embryos will look very, very similar. Um, and so, for example, for humans, in our early development, we have a posterior tail. We have pharyngeal gill slits. And this is similar to what we see in all other vertebrate embryos. The difference is later on in development of that embryo, those structures will be modified and turned into other structures. So, for example, the pharyngeal throat pouches could become gills in fish, or they could become some of the bones and throat structures in humans. And so that's what those pharyngeal gill pouches develop and modify into throughout human embryonic development. So here we have two figures of two vertebrate embryos. One is a chicken embryo on the left-hand side. The right-hand side is a human embryo. They look almost identical, which is amazing to me. They both have pharyngeal gill pouches. You can see the gill slits there. You can see gill slits here. They have postanal tail. And if you compared many other vertebrate embryos side by side, it is almost, I mean, it's so difficult to tell these embryos apart at these early stages. And again, it's not until the later stages of embryonic development that these pharyngeal gill pouches and this postanal tail start to develop into other structures, and begins to become differentiated into the structures that we know that are present in these kind of adult organisms. And so it's just this really interesting relationship that shows similarity in these features that are shared throughout the vertebrate lineage, which again suggests common ancestry within all of these species. Okay. Um, Now what we're going to get into is how we look at relationships between organisms. So we have this evidence that we can use to help us infer evolutionary history and gain an evolutionary understanding. Now, whenever we want to look at the evolutionary history and relationships of species and traits that the species may have, we can then use evolutionary trees, or what we call phylogenies, phylogenetic trees, to help us kind of map out that understanding of those evolutionary relationships. And Darwin did this whenever he was kind of going through, the mental work, the mental like exercises and thought processes of how descent with modification would happen. And so he visualized life as a tree. And we illustrate this as, again, these evolutionary trees, these phylogenetic trees today. And we can map these structures on the evolutionary trees to determine relationships between species. And one thing I want to point out here is that whenever a researcher makes an evolutionary tree, it's not ever 100% accurate unless we, um, as I should say, it's really difficult to know if these relationships are 100% accurate, right? And so these evolutionary trees, these phylogenetic hypotheses, are just that. They're hypotheses that reflect our current understanding of evolutionary descent and ancestral relationships. And these trees can change as our data and our understanding of these relationships changes as research continues. And so, for example, based off of today's knowledge, this is a basic relationship of um, fish to amphibians to terrestrial vertebrates, so some of the major groups, and how they are related. Now, if we get new data, then that can change, and it actually has changed even within. I don't know about your lifetime; it depends on how your age, but at least within my lifetime, birds used to have their own class. So it used to be like amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. But now, new data and information since then has put birds within the group of reptiles. So now it's reptiles and birds, because we now know that birds evolved from a specific group of dinosaurs that were these raptor, small microraptor, Archaeopteryx like dinosaurs that eventually led to the evolution of all of the bird species that we see and have today. And so that is a good example of how these evolutionary hypotheses can and have changed. And so the way you read these evolutionary trees is there are several nodes on these trees. Okay, so everywhere there's a number is an ancestral node. Okay, the tips also are known as the taxa, are the organisms of interest that you're trying to infer relationships. The lines are referred to as branches. So this is one branch, okay? And this branch here has split, right? It has split into two branches and so on and so forth. So we have this nested relationship here. And the way you read this tree is this ancestor here gave rise to ostriches and other birds. Okay, so ostriches and all of the other birds share a common ancestor, and we don't really know what this ancestor is per se, but we know that there's this hypothetical ancestor here. Okay, what number 5 is saying is that this ancestor at number 5 gave rise to ancestor 6 and its descendants, and also crocodiles. So this population split, crocodiles evolved, and then all of your other birds evolved. Okay. And so this doesn't mean that crocodiles just appeared instantly. There are a lot of steps that have to happen along this branch to get from ancestor 5 to crocodiles. A lot of evolutionary changes that we're just kind of simplifying here. Okay. And so what we can read with this evolutionary tree is that ostriches and other birds are more closely related to each other because they share a common ancestor than they are with crocodiles and lizards, right? Because they have a common ancestor, they're more closely related. This is an example of what we call sister taxa, okay? But because this ancestor gave rise to all of the organisms here, lungfishes are equally related to amphibians, mammals, and all of the others. And so they're equally related because the ancestor that they came from gave rise to all of those groups, ostriches, right? But mammals are more closely related to lizards, snakes, and crocodiles than they are to amphibians, because mammals share a more recent common ancestor with lizards than they do amphibians. Okay, and so that's some of the ways we can look at reading these evolutionary trees. We also, once we have these relationships made, we can look at where traits appear. So for example, tetrapod limbs. So everything after node 1, ancestor 1, has limbs. Okay, whereas snakes lost limbs, right? So there would have to be a change there for the snakes where they lost limbs. All the others have limbs, right? Then here we have the development of an amnion, right? So mammals don't have eggs, right? They kind of lost eggs, whereas everything else does have eggs, right? And so we can map like feathers. This group has feathers, and the rest doesn't. Um, and so you can map the traits to see where these traits evolved. And so based off of this evolutionary tree, we know feathers would evolve somewhere in between the evolution of crocodiles and birds. Okay. All right. And so that's it for the third module. So here we talked a lot about evidence for fossils or evidence for evolution in the form of fossils, homologies, and developmental similarities between species. Okay. Next, we're actually going to get into some of the key ideas of evolution and evolutionary theory, and we're going to talk a lot about natural selection and kind of what leads to evolution in populations. And so with that, we'll see you in the next video.